Imagine a land in the heart of Europe, crossed by mighty rivers and covered by dense forests, a land where people left their first traces tens of thousands of years ago. This land still had no name, no borders, no state, and yet it already carried within it secrets that would mark the origin of a culture, an identity, and eventually a nation. Germany, Mini Hook. Perhaps you know the image of modern Germany, industrial, disciplined, creative. But our story today does not begin in the Reichstag in Berlin, not with Bismarck, and not with the wars of the 20th century. It begins in dark caves, with the footsteps of the first humans, with the sounds of a bone flute that is considered the oldest musical instrument of humankind, and with symbols that were scratched into the earth thousands of years ago. Over time, this land became a stage for great encounters. Here, Celts and Germanic tribes met. Here, the mighty Roman Empire advanced as far as the Rhine and the Danube. Here, new kingdoms, religions, and ideas emerged. Step by step, age by age, the great mosaic of German history was formed from many fragments. In the next 60 to 80 minutes, we will walk together through 22 parts, from prehistory to globalization, from the Nebra sky disk to the cry of "We Are the People" in the autumn of 1989. This is not only a journey through time, but also a search for the roots of German identity, for the reasons why a country in the center of Europe became a cultural, political, and intellectual focal point of the world. Let us begin this journey at the dawn of humanity, in a place without a name, but full of meaning for the future. If we go all the way back to the very beginning, the trail leads us far beyond the age of emperors, kings, or castles. Long before there were names, countries, or borders, people lived here who moved through forests, camped by rivers, and shaped their world with fire, stone, and bone. More than 40,000 years ago, when the climate was unstable and the landscape was shaped by glaciers, rivers, and steppes, the first modern humans settled in the territory of present-day Germany. They hunted wild horses, mammoths, and reindeer, gathered berries and roots, and organized themselves into small groups that left only faint traces in the ground but deep marks in human history. Particularly impressive are the finds from the Swabian Jura. In caves such as Hohensteinstale and Geisenklosterle, ivory figurines were discovered that count among the oldest known works of art in human history. The famous Lion Man, carved from mammoth ivory, shows the power of imagination, a hybrid being of animal and human, a symbol of myths that were already taking shape even then. Equally fascinating are the bone flutes, made from swan bones or mammoth ivory. These instruments, more than 30,000 years old, are considered the oldest musical instruments in the world and prove that music and culture already played a unifying role in the Stone Age. These testimonies are more than archaeological objects. They speak of an inner life, of creativity, of the need to interpret the world. While similar developments were taking place in other regions of the earth, Central Europe became a unique melting pot where early culture and nature were joined together. One could say that even before a state arose here, this land was already a stage for ideas that reached far beyond mere survival. With the end of the Ice Age, as forests spread and the climate became milder, people began to live more permanently in one place. The first camps became recurring settlements. Tools grew more refined, techniques more precise. The foundations for the later Neolithic revolution were laid. This transition marked a deep turning point. Hunters and gatherers would become farmers and livestock breeders, and with that change began the real history of society, order, and economy. Thus, a picture opens before us of an age without writing and without names, but full of meaning. It is the foundation on which all later developments stand. Let us imagine for a moment the world of Central Europe at the end of the Ice Age. The glaciers retreated, forests spread, and with them human life changed. What had once been shaped by hunting and gathering began to transform fundamentally. From the nomadic groups that followed wild game, communities emerged that stayed in one place, cultivated fields, and tamed animals. It was the beginning of what we call the Neolithic Revolution, a turning point that changed everything. Around the 6th millennium before Christ, this new way of life reached the territory of present-day Germany. Archaeologists speak of the so-called linear pottery culture, named after the typical line patterns on its ceramic vessels. These people built long wooden houses that could shelter several families, and they laid out fields in which they grew emmer, einkorn, and barley. They kept cattle, pigs, goats, and sheep, a completely different way of life from that of their hunting ancestors. Sedentary life brought not only food security, but also new forms of society. Whoever owned land, whoever kept more animals, gained influence. The first differences in wealth became visible, and with that, the Neolithic laid the foundation for social hierarchies that would become more pronounced in later ages. The relationship to nature also changed. What had once been immediate use of the environment became deliberate shaping of it. Forests were cleared, rivers were controlled, soils were permanently cultivated. Compared to mobile hunter groups, life was more predictable, but also more risky. Crop failures could trigger famine. Disease spread more quickly in settlements, and conflicts over land increased. Nevertheless, this new way of life prevailed because it made larger communities possible, and those communities in turn promoted protection, division of labor, and cultural exchange. The comparison with other regions is especially exciting. While the Neolithic Revolution had begun thousands of years earlier in the Near East and Anatolia, Central Europe came later. But its adoption was by no means passive. A style of its own developed here. The linear pottery people, with their typical houses and ceramics, created a culture that quickly spread along the great river valleys of the Rhine, Danube, and Elbe. This age also gave rise to the first graves with grave goods, pointing to a new understanding of life after death. Jewelry, tools, and vessels accompanied the dead, a sign that spirituality and religion were gaining importance. In this way, the Neolithic Revolution appears not only as an economic change but also as an intellectual one. The step from hunter to farmer led into a new world of settled life, social order, and the first religious symbols. When the people of Central Europe began to use metals, a new era began. Copper and tin were fused into bronze, a material harder than stone and yet more workable, shining and durable. This discovery changed not only technology but the entire structure of society. Bronze tools made agriculture more efficient, weapons strengthened military power, and artistic ornaments gave status to those who wore them. The Bronze Age was marked by new hierarchies. Valuable grave goods were found in burials, swords, axes, golden clasps. Such finds show that power was now more visibly tied to wealth. Whoever had access to metal gained influence. Trade played a decisive role because copper and tin had to be transported over long distances. From the Alps to the North Sea, networks emerged that circulated not only goods but also ideas. One outstanding testimony of this age is the Nebra sky disk. It was found in the state of Saxony-Anhalt and is dated to around the 2nd millennium before Christ. Golden symbols are inlaid into a bronze disk, sun, moon, stars, including a cluster identified with the Pleiades. The disk is not only a work of art, it is also regarded as one of the oldest concrete depictions of the heavens in human history. It combines astronomical knowledge with religious symbolism and shows that the people of this age not only observed the cosmos but incorporated it into their understanding of the world. The Nebra sky disk makes clear that the Bronze Age was more than a phase of technical innovation. It was a time in which spirituality, power, and knowledge entered into their first close connections. While monumental temples and written cultures emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt, Central Europe found its own mode of expression, not through gigantic buildings, but through objects that connected heaven and earth. Compared with the preceding Neolithic, the leap was enormous. Small farming communities became societies that traded across great distances, developed structures of rule, and expanded their mental horizons far beyond everyday survival. In this way, the Bronze Age opened a new chapter in the history of the land. It laid the groundwork for political and economic complexity and gave rise to a world in which power, belief, and knowledge were intertwined for the first time. With the beginning of the Iron Age, which set in around the 8th century before Christ, the face of Central Europe changed again. Iron, a metal harder, and at the same time more widely available than bronze, revolutionized tools and weapons. Fields could now be worked more efficiently, forests cleared more quickly, and military conflicts fought with sharper swords. This technical innovation deeply shaped societies and created the basis for new cultural and political developments. In the south of what is now Germany lived the Celts. They were not only skilled craftsmen who produced fine jewelry of gold and iron, but also traders who maintained wide-reaching networks. Their fortified settlements, the so-called oppida, such as Manching, show a surprising degree of urbanity. Coins, trade goods, and ceramic finds reveal contacts as far as the Mediterranean. The Celts possessed an early form of writing using Greek and later Latin letters adapted for their own purposes. Their culture was multi-layered, rich in myths, religion, and craftsmanship, and they left clear traces in southern Germany. North and east of them lived groups later described by Roman authors under the collective term Germans. Yet this term conceals diversity. They were not one unified people, but numerous tribes with different dialects, customs, and ways of life. Tacitus, the Roman historian, portrayed them as simple, brave, and close to nature. But his depictions were more moral reflections of Roman values than neutral observation. Archaeologically, these groups are harder to grasp because they left behind fewer permanent settlements and written testimonies. Yet finds of weapons, ceramics, and graves show that they too possessed complex structures. Compared with the Celts, the Germanic tribes seemed less developed from the Roman point of view, yet their adaptability to the landscape, their kin-based social structures, and their military resilience made them a decisive factor in the later balance of power in Europe. While the Celts formed larger political units, the Germanic tribes remained more decentralized, which gave them flexibility but also internal fragmentation. Thus, in the Iron Age, two cultural spheres existed side by side, the outward-looking, highly connected Celts in the south, and the heterogeneous, resilient Germanic peoples in the north and east. This coexistence of diversity and difference formed the background on which Rome later appeared. When the Roman Empire reached its height, its influence extended far beyond the Mediterranean. The territory of present-day Germany also came into view, especially the rivers Rhine and Danube, which became natural borders and later political lines. As early as the 1st century before Christ, Gaius Julius Caesar, during his Gallic Wars, encountered tribes along the Rhine that he described as Germans. His reports were not only observations, but political instruments with which he justified his conquests and portrayed the Germans as wild, fearless opponents. With the expansion of Roman power northward, a new constellation emerged. Cities such as Cologne, Mainz, and Trier were founded or greatly expanded and developed into centers of trade, administration, and culture. These places were more than military strongholds. They were points of contact between two worlds. Roman architecture, with temples, theaters, baths, and roads, shaped the landscape, and excavations still show how strongly the region was Romanized. The Rhine became a stable frontier. South and west of it, people lived within a Roman order. North of it remained Germanic tribes who traded and maintained contacts but were not integrated into the empire. The same was true of the Danube, which also served as a border river. Along these lines, the so-called limes arose, a system of forts, watchtowers, and palisades stretching over hundreds of kilometers. It was less an impenetrable wall than a zone of control regulating the flow of goods, movement of people, and military operations. The comparison is revealing. While Britain was fully occupied and turned into a Roman province, the territory east of the Rhine remained permanently outside direct control. The reason lay not only in the resistance of the tribes, but also in the enormous military and logistical challenge of conquering such a vast, forested territory. The Romans therefore concentrated on security and influence rather than complete integration. And yet the contact was intense. Germanic warriors served as auxiliaries in the Roman army. Elites adopted Roman lifestyles, and Roman coins, ceramics, and jewelry made their way into settlements north of the Rhine. This interaction shows that the frontier separated, but also connected. It was a space of exchange in which new identities and power relations emerged. Soon, however, an event occurred that deeply shook Rome and shattered the myth of Roman invincibility, the famous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which would shape relations between Romans and Germans for centuries. In late summer of the year 9 after Christ, a Roman army under the governor Publius Quintilius Varus marched into the territory east of the Rhine. 3 legions, supported by auxiliary troops and baggage trains, advanced through dense forests and difficult terrain. Rome believed the situation was under control because among the Germanic allies stood Arminius, a prince of the Cherusei who had been raised and militarily trained in Rome. Yet this man, who appeared to fight loyally at Rome's side, had long pursued a different plan. In a carefully prepared ambush, the Germanic fighters used the terrain to their advantage. Rain, mud, and narrow woodland paths made the Roman marching order vulnerable. The fighting dragged on for days, and in the end the 3 legions were almost completely annihilated. Tens of thousands of soldiers, along with many camp followers, lost their lives. The defeat was so devastating that Emperor Augustus is said to have cried out in despair, "Varus, give me back my legions." A sentence that still preserves the dimension of this shock. The battle was not only a military catastrophe, but a turning point in Roman policy. Rome abandoned its plans to permanently conquer the territory east of the Rhine and instead stabilized the frontier along the Rhine and Danube. While other regions, such as Britain or Gaul, were fully Romanized, the territory of present-day Germany remained outside direct control. The Teutoburg Forest became a symbol that even the mightiest order of antiquity had limits. Compared with other setbacks of the empire such as Carrhae against the Parthians, one difference becomes clear. While Rome continued to expand in the east, it withdrew in the north. The reason lay not only in military defeat, but also in the realization that the Germanic tribes were decentralized and therefore difficult to subdue. Their resilience rested less on central power than on flexibility and local knowledge, qualities that Rome found hard to counter with its rigid legionary tactics. Yet contact between the two worlds continued. Trade, diplomacy, and military cooperation remained. But the trauma of Teutoburg shaped the Roman perception of the Germanic world for generations. From a region to be conquered, it became a frontier land full of risks, but also of opportunities. After the catastrophe in the Teutoburg Forest, the Romans withdrew, but the story between them and the Germanic tribes did not end with that single blow. Rather, a long phase of changing contacts began, in which trade, diplomacy, and conflict existed side by side. The Rhine and the Danube remained border lines, but they were never impermeable walls. In forts and cities along the Limes, from Cologne through Mainz to Regensburg, lively exchange developed. Merchants brought wine, olive oil, glass vessels, and fine ceramics from Italy and Gaul, while Germanic tribes in return supplied furs, livestock, and amber. Coin finds in Germanic settlements show how strong Roman influence was even beyond the frontier. Germanic elites began to integrate Roman everyday objects into their own lives, and Roman weapons or ornaments were often found in the graves of important leaders. Yet this exchange went hand in hand with deliberate distancing. The Romans continued to regard the Germans as barbaric and uncivilized, even if they respected their military strength. Tacitus, for example, described them in his Germania both as a morally pure counterworld to decadent Rome and as a threatening force. This ambivalence shows how difficult it was for the Romans to form a consistent image of their neighbors. For the Germans, Rome was both a model and an enemy. They adopted Roman technologies and luxury goods, but at the same time held to their own social structures, built more on kinship and local leadership than on centralized authority. A particularly important aspect of this relationship was the military. Many Germanic warriors served as mercenaries in Roman legions or as auxiliary troops. Some received Roman citizenship, others returned after years of service with new battle experience and strengthened the military power of their tribes. In this way, a reciprocal effect emerged. Germans fought for Rome and at the same time against Rome. Compared with other frontier regions, such as Britain, Central Europe played a special role. Where in other provinces, full integration succeeded, the Roman-Germanic relationship here remained a constant balancing act between closeness and distance. It was precisely this tension that made the region north of the Limes such a dynamic arena. Here, civilization and tribal society collided. But instead of a clear separation, a long process of observation, adaptation, and defense developed. When the Roman Empire came under increasing pressure in the 4th century after Christ, an age began that would change Europe forever, the migration period. It was not a sudden event, not a single march from north to south, but a centuries-long process in which whole groups of people were set in motion, driven by hunger, climate changes, internal conflicts, or the pressure of new powers pushing westward from the steppes of Central Asia. Among the best-known groups were the Visigoths, who after long migrations across the Balkans even sacked Rome in the year 410, a shock that shattered the self-image of the ancient world. The Vandals moved through Gaul, crossed the Iberian Peninsula, and finally founded their own kingdom in North Africa with Carthage as its center. The Lombards settled in Italy, the Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, and the Alemanni occupied territories in southwestern Germany. Particularly dramatic was the pressure of the Huns, who under Attila pushed westward in the 5th century. They forced Germanic tribes to leave their settlement areas and seek new homes. This chain reaction led to a migratory flow that completely redrew the political map of Europe. While Rome desperately tried to control these movements, the empire gradually lost the ability to secure its borders. Compared with earlier frontier conflicts, it becomes clear that this was no longer about isolated battles or trade contacts. Instead, permanent resettlements were taking place, giving rise to new kingdoms. The Germanic tribes, once loosely organized, now formed stable realms on the soil of the former empire. Thus began a transformation. Out of the world of antiquity emerged the world of the Middle Ages. For the territory of present-day Germany, the migration period meant a time of deep upheaval. Old Roman structures collapsed, but Roman heritage did not disappear completely. Cities such as Trier, Cologne, and Mainz remained. Roads and bridges continued to be used, and Christianity began to spread among the Germanic peoples as well. It was a coexistence of collapse and renewal, of loss and creative force. The migration period showed how movable history can be. It destroyed existing orders, but at the same time opened new perspectives. Out of chaos emerged the seeds of later European kingdoms. At this point, one people moved to the foreground, and for the history of Germany it would become decisive: the Franks, who built their power in the shadow of the collapsing Roman Empire and opened a new chapter in European history. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in 476, its legacy remained tangible. Roads, cities, administrative structures, and above all the Christian Church survived the political collapse. In this field of tension, the Franks emerged, originally a loose tribal confederation on the Lower Rhine, which quickly developed into a dominant power in Western Europe. Under King Clovis, the first important ruler of the Merovingians, the Franks succeeded in extending their power to the south and west. They defeated rival groups such as the Alemanni and Thuringians and established a kingdom that encompassed large parts of present-day France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. But the real turning point lay not only in military success, but in a decision that permanently shaped the face of Europe: the baptism of Clovis. Around the year 500, Clovis was baptized into the Catholic faith, a step of enormous symbolic power. While other Germanic rulers, such as the Visigoths or Vandals, adhered to Arian Christianity and thus stood in opposition to the Roman Church, Clovis aligned himself directly with the Catholic confession. This decision brought him not only the support of the Gallo-Roman population, but also the backing of the clergy. In this way, the Franks became the first Germanic people to enter into a close alliance with the Roman Catholic Church. Compared with other successor kingdoms of the empire, which were often short-lived and unstable, this alliance gave the Frankish realm exceptional legitimacy. The Church granted sacred authority to kingship, while the rulers promoted the spread of the faith. Monasteries arose, missionaries preached, and Christianity slowly took root even in the regions east of the Rhine. Yet the baptism was not only a religious gesture, it was also a political move. Through it, Clovis created a link between the Roman legacy and the new Frankish rule. From the fallen empire there emerged a new order combining ancient traditions, Germanic structures, and Christian faith. This union formed the basis for what would later be called the Christian West. From it developed a model in which kingship and church were closely intertwined, a pattern that would shape European history for centuries. After Clovis's death, the kingdom initially fragmented under his successors, and rivalries weakened it. Yet the basis had been laid on which the Carolingians would later build. With Charles Martel and above all Charlemagne, the Frankish realm would finally become an empire that grew beyond the legacy of Rome and shaped a new Europe. When Clovis and the Franks turned toward Christianity, the conversion of Central Europe remained at first a laborious process lasting centuries. Faith cannot simply be imposed from above. It must grow, shaped by people, places, and rituals. Missionaries and monasteries played a decisive role in this development. As early as the 6th century, Irish and Scottish monks such as Columbanus and Gallus came into the Germanic lands. They founded small monasteries that were not only spiritual centers, but also schools, hospitals, and workshops. The monastery of St. Gallen, named after St. Gallus, in particular became a beacon of learning and written culture. Here, libraries arose that preserved and transmitted ancient knowledge, while outside pagan customs still shaped everyday life. In the 8th century, another major figure appeared, the Anglo-Saxon Boniface. He is regarded as the apostle of the Germans because, on behalf of the Pope, he advanced Christianization in Hesse, Thuringia, and Bavaria. With the symbolic felling of the Donar oak near Geismar, he demonstrated that the Christian God was stronger than the old Germanic gods. Even if this story is probably more legend than historical fact, it nonetheless shows how strongly missionaries relied on signs and symbols in order to convince people of the new faith. The monasteries were more than religious places. They became crystallization points of a new order. Within their walls, documents were written, agriculture was organized, and knowledge was systematically collected. Monks developed techniques of land use, cultivated vineyards, maintained herb gardens for healing, and laid the foundations for structured administration. While large parts of Central Europe still lived without writing and without fixed laws, the monasteries created islands of order and stability. Compared with other parts of Europe such as Ireland or Italy, the Christianization of Central Europe was much more closely connected with political power. In Ireland, monastic life was more independent, whereas in the Frankish world kingship and church formed an alliance that supported each other. Christianity thus became not only a religion, but also an instrument of power that legitimized rule and stabilized structures. Yet Christianization also brought tensions. Old customs did not disappear immediately, but were often absorbed into Christian festivals. Pagan rituals became feast days, springs became sacred sites, solstice celebrations became church festivals. In this way, tradition and innovation merged, creating a unique mixture that shaped everyday life. This close intertwining of faith, politics, and culture prepared the ground for a new age, because soon a ruler would appear who would gather all these currents together and shape them into a realm that could rightly be called the heart of Europe, Charlemagne. When Charles assumed rule over the Frankish kingdom in 768, a ruler stepped onto the stage who would shape the fate of Europe like few others. He was the son of Pepin the Short, the grandson of Charles Martel. His origin was important, but what he made of this legacy went far beyond what one could imagine in the early Middle Ages. Charlemagne was not only a king, he was warrior, judge, reformer, and missionary in one person. His rule was marked by a clear goal: to create order in a world full of unrest. Through a series of campaigns, he expanded his kingdom deep into Italy, conquered the Lombard realm, forced the Avars in the Pannonian Basin to their knees, and waged the bitter Saxon Wars over decades. This struggle in the north against tribes that held firmly to their pagan customs especially reveals the harshness of his policy. Forced baptisms, destroyed sanctuaries, and bloody reprisals make clear that for Charles, Christianization was inseparable from securing rule. Yet Charles was not only a man of war. In his residence at Aachen, a court arose that drew scholars from across Europe. With Alcuin of York and other thinkers, he established the so-called Carolingian Renaissance, an educational movement that gathered, ordered, and newly transmitted ancient knowledge. Schools were founded, manuscripts copied, and the Carolingian minuscule developed, a script that brought clarity and uniformity and continued to influence later centuries. Here, power was joined with education, and military conquest became cultural shaping. The high point of his reign was undoubtedly Christmas Day of the year 800. In Rome, Pope Leo III placed the crown upon Charles and raised him to the rank of Roman emperor. This coronation was more than a symbolic act. It linked itself to the legacy of the old empire and at the same time laid claim to universal rule. Rome had not perished. It lived on in new form, with Charlemagne as protector of Christendom and guardian of order. Compared with other rulers of his time, it becomes clear that he was more than one king among many. While in Britain or Scandinavia tribal kings still ruled, Charles created a political and religious unity that laid the foundation for later medieval Europe. Yet his empire was fragile. After his death, it soon broke apart under his grandsons. Still, the idea he embodied remained alive, the vision of an emperorship that transcended nations. After the death of Charlemagne in 814, his son Louis the Pious initially managed to hold the enormous empire together. But cracks in the unity soon appeared, and after Louis's death in 840 a bitter conflict broke out among his sons. This struggle culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, by which the Frankish Empire was divided into three parts: a western kingdom, the later France, a middle kingdom stretching from Italy to the North Sea, and an eastern kingdom, the so-called East Frankish realm. This East Frankish realm, which essentially included large parts of present-day Germany, was not a centralized state, but a web of duchies such as Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, Franconia, and Lotharingia. The king possessed only limited power, and much depended on his ability to bind regional dukes to himself. Therein lay both the weakness and the flexibility of this early order. In contrast to France, where the crown increasingly lost authority, the East Frankish realm would in the long run develop a stability of its own. A decisive turning point came with the election of Henry I in 919. This Duke of Saxony, later also known as Henry the Fowler, laid the foundation for a new dynasty, the Ottonians. Through skillful alliances and military strength, Henry succeeded in consolidating the realm. He resisted the Magyars, who had ravaged Central Europe with their mounted armies for decades, and created a basis on which his son Otto could build. Otto I, later given the epithet the Great, continued his father's policy and strengthened royal power through close cooperation with the Church. Bishops and abbots received not only spiritual authority, but also secular offices, so that they served as a counterweight to often headstrong dukes. This approach, later called the imperial church system, was a unique model that would endure for centuries. Militarily, Otto proved his strength in 955 at the Battle of Lechfeld near Augsburg, where he decisively defeated the Magyars. This victory not only secured the realm from external threats, but also gave Otto great prestige throughout Europe. 7 years later, in 962, he was crowned emperor in Rome by the Pope. In this way he consciously tied himself to the legacy of Charlemagne and laid the foundation for what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire. Compared with the Merovingians or Carolingians, the Ottonians distinguished themselves less by territorial expansion than by political stability and integration with the Church. They created an order in which king, church, and regional powers were bound together in a delicate balance. In the 11th century, the relationship between spiritual and secular power reached a dramatic climax. Since the time of the Ottonians, it had been common practice for kings and emperors to appoint bishops and abbots, invest them with their insignia, and thus make them loyal supports of their rule. This so-called imperial church system gave the king a solid base against the dukes, who often pursued their own interests. But with the church reform movement that began in Cluny in Burgundy and spread throughout Europe, this model was called into question. The Church wanted to free itself from secular influence. Pope Gregory VII insisted that the Church alone had the right to appoint bishops. For King Henry IV, this was a direct attack on his authority. He saw himself threatened not only in his practice of rule, but in his very self-understanding as a ruler appointed by God. The conflict escalated quickly. Henry declared the Pope deposed, while Gregory excommunicated the king. For the standards of the time, this was a political catastrophe. Whoever stood under the ban lost not only access to the sacraments, but also the loyalty of his followers. Many princes seized the opportunity to turn away from the king. In this situation came one of the most famous events of the Middle Ages, the Walk to Canossa, in the winter of 1077. Henry, barefoot in the snow before the castle of Canossa, asked the Pope for forgiveness. For 3 days Gregory let him wait before lifting the ban. This image of the humiliated ruler burned itself deeply into the collective memory, a symbol that even the mightiest ruler in Europe could be subjected to the authority of the Church. Yet the conflict was by no means over. For decades, the investiture controversy shaped the political structure of the empire. At last, in the Concordat of Worms in 1122, a compromise was reached. The emperor retained influence over the election of bishops, but spiritual investiture remained in the hands of the Church. Compared with developments in England or France, where tension between spiritual and secular power was also intense, the issue was especially consequential in the Holy Roman Empire, because kingship there depended heavily on the support of the imperial church. The investiture controversy exposed a basic question of the Middle Ages: who had the final word, the emperor or the pope? While emperors and popes struggled over power and influence, a quiet but profound change was taking place inside the empire. It was not the swords of knights that set Europe in motion, but markets, trade routes, and the growing cities. From the 12th century onward, a new age began in which urban centers became engines of change. Cologne, Nuremberg, Lübeck, and Augsburg developed into vibrant cities whose walls offered not only protection, but also freedom. Whoever moved into a town and lived there for a year and a day was freed from serfdom. A revolutionary thought in a society that had until then been deeply shaped by feudal structures. Cities offered space for initiative, for guilds, for markets, and for a new social class, the burghers. In the north, a network of astonishing strength grew out of small trading centers, the Hanseatic League. Originally an association of merchants for mutual protection, in the 13th and 14th centuries this alliance developed into a power capable of challenging kings and princes. Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and later Danzig became hubs of Baltic trade. From there came salt from Lüneburg, fish from Scandinavia, furs from Russia, and grain from Prussia to all parts of Europe. The Hanse was not a state. It had neither a standing army nor a fixed government, and yet it could wage wars, negotiate treaties, and secure trade monopolies. In a certain sense, it was a counter-model to feudal rule. Instead of being founded on descent and titles, its power rested on trade, trust, and mutual agreements. Compared with the Italian city-states, such as Venice or Genoa, it becomes clear that in Northern Europe too a maritime trading power emerged that radiated far beyond its region. This economic rise changed ways of thinking. Time was measured in markets, contracts were fixed in writing, profits were calculated. With the cities came new forms of culture. Town halls with splendid facades, cathedrals rising into the sky, and universities where scholars debated philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. Yet the flourishing of the cities also brought tensions. Within the walls, guilds and patrician families fought for influence, while princes tried to regain control. Nevertheless, the city remained a symbol of freedom, progress, and self-confidence, a mirror of a society beginning to loosen itself from purely agrarian life. Then, in the midst of an age of economic growth, when cities were expanding, markets were flourishing, and the Hanseatic League was spreading its trade networks across northern and eastern Europe, a catastrophe struck that shook the whole continent. In 1347, the plague reached Europe, probably aboard ships sailing from Crimea to Italy. From there, it spread at tremendous speed along the trade routes across the continent, and the Holy Roman Empire was no exception. The disease, later called the Black Death, brought mass death on a scale previously unimaginable. Within a few years, in some regions, a third to half of the population died. Cities such as Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and Lübeck saw scenes of despair. Streets were lined with corpses, markets deserted, churches overcrowded with funeral masses. No one was safe, neither princes nor peasants, neither clergy nor children. The medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to understand the cause. People spoke of poisoned air, divine punishment, or planetary constellations. In the search for the guilty, the anger of many turned against minorities, especially Jewish communities, which were cruelly persecuted in pogroms. Thus the catastrophe became not only a medical crisis, but also a social one that shattered relations among people. And yet, destructive as the plague was, it also initiated profound changes. Fewer people meant more land, higher wages, and greater social mobility. Peasants could demand better conditions. Many moved into cities, loosening the structure of old serfdom. In the towns, the labor shortage led to new structures in crafts and trade. Women took over tasks previously reserved for men, and society began to change in unexpected ways. Thought changed too. Constant confrontation with mortality fostered a new awareness of time, meaning, and finitude. In art appeared dances of death and dark motifs, while literature documented the crisis soberly. At the same time, the experience of the failure of church authority, priests died just like laypeople, masses went unsaid, laid the foundation for doubts about the all-powerfulness of the Church, doubts that would later find a new dimension in the Reformation. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Church in the Empire seemed all-present and unshakable. Monasteries, parishes, and bishoprics shaped the land, while indulgence letters, relic cults, and splendid ceremonies determined the daily lives of believers. But beneath the shining surface, unrest was growing. Many people doubted the credibility of a church that on the one hand promised the path to salvation, while on the other sold indulgences for money and lost itself in pomp and power. Into this field of tension stepped Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and professor of theology from Wittenberg. On 31 October 1517, he published his 95 Theses, an invitation to debate that struck like thunder. Luther's initial concern was not to break with the church, but to return to Holy Scripture, a call for truth and clarity in faith. Thanks to the newly invented printing press, his writings spread with astonishing speed. Within a few months, his texts were no longer only in Wittenberg, but throughout Germany, and soon in other parts of Europe as well. For many, it was a liberation to read the Word of God in their own language, instead of relying solely on Latin sermons and ecclesiastical mediation. The reaction of the Church did not take long. Luther was summoned, condemned, and finally excommunicated. Yet he remained firm. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, he refused to recant his writings with the famous words, "Here I stand, I can do no other." This moment marked the final break and turned a scholar into a reformer of world historical importance. The consequences were far-reaching. Numerous princes used the opportunity to free themselves from the Roman Church and establish their own territorial churches. Religious conviction thus became linked to political sovereignty. The Reformation was therefore not only a movement of faith, but also a transformation of power structures within the empire. Schools, Bible translations, and new forms of worship permanently changed everyday life. Compared with earlier reform movements in England or Bohemia, it becomes clear why this time the movement endured. It connected itself to the interests of powerful princes, found support among the people, and used the new possibilities of print. Yet the new freedom also brought conflict. Peasants' wars, confessional division, and political power struggles made it clear that the call for truth awakened not only hope, but also unrest. The religious unity of the empire broke apart, and from the dream of a renewed church grew a deep divide between Catholics and Protestants. This rupture would shape Europe for centuries and finally lead into one of the most devastating conflicts in its history, the 30 Years' War. When, in 1618 in Prague, two imperial envoys were thrown out of a castle window, no one yet knew that this so-called defenestration of Prague would mark the beginning of one of the most destructive conflicts in Europe. The 30 Years' War, which would last until 1648, turned the Holy Roman Empire into a battlefield that spared hardly any region. Originally begun as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, the war soon developed into a struggle over power, territory, and influence. The defeat of the Bohemian Winter King Frederick of the Palatinate in 1620 at the Battle of White Mountain already showed that the issues were not only matters of faith, but also dynastic and political interests. Over the decades, powers such as Spain, Sweden, France, and Denmark intervened, so that a German war became a pan-European conflagration. The consequences for the population were catastrophic. Whole regions were plundered, villages burned, towns depopulated. Mercenary armies, often poorly paid and undisciplined, lived by robbery and violence. Hunger, disease, and displacement claimed far more victims than the battles themselves. Estimates suggest that in some areas of the empire up to 2/3 of the people lost their lives. Politically, the conflict drove the empire to the edge of collapse. The emperor in Vienna could assert himself only with difficulty against rebellious princes and unreliable allies. Commanders such as Wallenstein appeared, men who at times possessed more power than the emperor himself. At the same time, trust in the idea that religion alone could provide unity finally broke down. And yet the catastrophe also led to a new beginning. The Peace of Westphalia, concluded in 1648 in Münster and Osnabrück, created a new order. It guaranteed the coexistence of different confessions, strengthened the rights of princes, and permanently weakened imperial authority. The empire became even more fragmented, but at the same time this peace laid the foundation for modern international law and the principle of state sovereignty. After the horrors of the 30 Years' War, the empire longed for stability and order. The Peace of Westphalia of 1648 had created a new balance in which more than 300 territories governed themselves, yet coexisted under the roof of the empire. This fragmentation brought weakness in relation to external powers, but also opened spaces for cultural and intellectual diversity. In this age, the Baroque flourished, an art form that displayed the claims of princes through splendid palaces, rich churches, and imposing gardens. In residences such as Würzburg, Dresden, or Karlsruhe, a world was reflected that sought brilliance and representation, even though the daily lives of many subjects remained marked by hardship. The Baroque was not only an expression of princely power, but also an attempt to bring beauty and order back into life after centuries of war. At the same time, the Enlightenment spread, a movement carried by reason, science, and education. At universities such as Halle, Göttingen, and Königsberg, scholars debated natural law, ethics, and the role of the human being in society. Philosophers such as Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Immanuel Kant asked questions that changed the foundations of thought. What is freedom? What is knowledge? What is responsibility? The empire itself remained more an observer than a driving force. While in France Louis XIV ruled with absolutist splendor and in England Parliament gained power, the Holy Roman Empire remained within its federal structure. Yet this very diversity allowed Enlightenment ideas to take root more quickly in some regions, while other principalities clung to older traditions. One actor, however, stepped forward who would decisively change the face of Germany: Prussia. From a fragmented territory, Frederick William I, the soldier king, formed a tightly organized state in the early 18th century. His son Frederick the Great combined military discipline with intellectual curiosity. He read Voltaire, played the flute, fought wars, and turned Prussia into a European great power. Compared with Austria, which as a multinational empire often acted heavily and slowly, Prussia appeared efficient, sober, and purposeful. This new balance of power within the empire created a lasting rivalry between Habsburg and Hohenzollern. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Holy Roman Empire seemed like an old tree, rooted, widely branched, gnarled, but still standing. For more than 800 years it had survived wars, crises, and reforms. But now a storm approached, stronger than anything before. Its name was Napoleon Bonaparte. France had reinvented itself after the Revolution of 1789. Freedom, equality, fraternity. These slogans shook all of Europe. Napoleon, who came from modest circumstances in Corsica, rose to become a general and finally seized power as consul and later emperor. With him came not only military strength, but also a new claim to order for the entire continent. In 1797, he forced the Peace of Campo Formio, which cost the empire its first major losses. The territories on the left bank of the Rhine, including Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, fell to France. A few years later came the Reichsdeputationshauptschluss of 1803, an administrative reform under French pressure that changed the face of the empire. More than 100 ecclesiastical principalities, abbeys, and imperial cities were dissolved, territories redistributed, and smaller lordships mediatized. What had grown over centuries disintegrated in a short time. Napoleon did not stop there. In 1806 he founded the Confederation of the Rhine, an alliance of German princes who submitted to his supremacy. With that, the empire was hollowed out from within. On 6 August of the same year, Emperor Francis II laid down the crown. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation no longer existed. ended not by a battle, but by a document. The fall of the old empire was both a break and a new beginning. On the one hand, it meant the loss of an order centuries old that, despite all its weaknesses, had offered a roof for diversity and stability. On the other hand, it opened space for new political structures no longer based on medieval traditions, but on modern concepts. The Napoleonic Code, with its principles of legal equality, protection of property, and administrative reform, left a lasting mark on many German territories. The middle of the 19th century was a time full of tension and expectation. In the cities of Germany, a new bourgeoisie was emerging, educated, politically interested, and dissatisfied with the rigidity of the German Confederation, which since the Congress of Vienna in 1815 had preserved fragmentation. Bread prices rose, factories changed the nature of work, and the longing for national unity grew louder. Then came the year 1848, the year of revolutions in Europe. Inspired by events in Paris, people also rose in Berlin, Vienna, and Frankfurt. Craftsmen, students, and workers demanded constitutions, basic rights, and a united Germany. In St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt, the First National Assembly met, a moment rich in symbolism. For the first time, deputies from all the German lands gathered to deliberate on freedom, unity, and democracy. The debates were passionate. Should Germany become a kingdom or a republic? Should Austria be part of it or not? In the end, a constitutional monarchy was decided upon, and the imperial crown was offered to the Prussian king Frederick William IV. But he refused it, mocking it as a crown from the gutter. Thus the dream of the revolutionaries collapsed, and the old order returned. Many activists fled into exile, some to America, others remained and waited for another opportunity. That opportunity came with Otto von Bismarck, a man from an entirely different tradition. When he was appointed Prime Minister of Prussia in 1862, he relied not on speeches or parliamentary resolutions, but on iron and blood. Step by step he used wars to create unity, first against Denmark in 1864, then against Austria in 1866, and finally against France in 1870. The Franco-German War in particular became the catalyst. As German troops besieged Paris and French power collapsed, the southern German states moved closer to Prussia. On 18 January 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, William I was proclaimed German emperor, a moment of immense symbolic force. Compared with the failed revolution of 1848, the irony of history becomes visible. What the liberals could not achieve through words and visions, Bismarck accomplished through diplomacy, intrigue, and military power. Germany was now a unified nation-state, but its birth carried within it the legacy of war and authority. When, in January 1871, William I was proclaimed German Emperor in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, it seemed as if a dream of many generations had been fulfilled. Germany was finally united, and the new empire quickly developed into a European great power. Railways linked cities, industrial centers grew in the Ruhr and in Silesia, and chemistry and electrical engineering made the empire a motor of innovation. Names such as Robert Koch, Werner von Siemens, and Carl Benz stood for progress and self-confidence. Yet this brilliance had its shadows. While the bourgeoisie rose and gained prosperity, millions of workers lived in cramped tenements, working long shifts without social protection. Bismarck responded with a double strategy. He fought social democracy with anti-socialist laws, but at the same time introduced the first systems of social insurance, health, accident, and pension insurance. In this way he laid the foundation of the modern welfare state, even though social tensions remained. Under William II, who came to the throne in 1888, the tone changed. The new emperor was ambitious, impetuous, and wanted to turn Germany into a world power. Naval expansion, colonial policy, and aggressive foreign policy created growing rivalry with Britain, France, and Russia. The world shall be healed by the German spirit, reflected a new nationalist self-understanding that inspired admiration and distrust at the same time. The tensions in Europe intensified when, on 28 June 1914 in Sarajevo, the Austrian heir to the throne Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. A chain reaction began. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany stood by Austria. France and Britain entered. Within days, a world war had emerged from an assassination. The First World War brought destruction on a scale never before seen. Battles such as the Somme or Verdun claimed hundreds of thousands of victims. Poison gas, machine guns, and artillery industrialized killing. Millions of men died, millions of families lost their loved ones. By 1918, the empire was exhausted. Hunger and uprisings brought down the Kaiser. The monarchy ended. The Weimar Republic was born. Yet defeat and the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, which imposed territorial losses, heavy reparations, and war guilt on Germany, left deep wounds. Many felt it to be a shameful peace. Out of this sense of humiliation grew a dangerous mixture of longing for order and open radicalization. Thus the path led directly from the glittering empire, through the abyss of world war into a fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic. When the Second World War ended in May 1945, Germany lay not only in ruins but also shattered in its identity. Out of the rubble rose two states that could hardly have been more different. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, democratic, federal, and integrated into the Western world. In the East, the German Democratic Republic, shaped by socialist ideology and Soviet control. The division was not only a political border. It cut through families, cities, and lives. It became especially visible from 13 August 1961 onward, when the Berlin Wall was erected, a symbol of the coldness of the Cold War, a concrete ban through the heart of Europe. Whoever tried to cross it risked their life. The wall became the emblem of a divided nation. And yet people continued living, with hopes, contradictions, and everyday routines. While in the West the so-called economic miracle brought prosperity, consumer goods, and new freedoms, the East experienced a state that promised social security but restricted freedom. The differences shaped an entire generation. Then came the autumn of 1989. In Leipzig and Berlin, thousands took to the streets, first with candles and prayers, then with loud voices. "We are the people" became the cry for freedom. On 9 November, the borders opened. The wall fell, a moment that entered world history. Only 1 year later, on 3 October 1990,